left to drown in the icy river. A Lakota chief pulled her out and gave her her breath back. The water was making that sound it makes in late November, not quite frozen, not quite free. A sound like something between breathing and dying. I heard it before I saw her. I had come down to the White River crossing to check the ice shelf on the eastern bank. We had 2 horses that liked to drink from that particular bend, and the shelf had been cracking for 3 days. I was not thinking about anything except the shelf and the horses, and whether the cold snap would hold through the week. My mind was on practical things. It usually is. She was maybe 30 yards downstream, caught against a deadfall cottonwood that had come down in the September floods. The trunk was white and peeled, and it lay half in the water, and she was draped over it like a piece of cloth someone had dropped. Her face was in the water. Her arms were out to the sides. I did not think. I was moving before I decided to move. The water hit me like an axe handle to the chest. That is the only way I can say it. November water in this country does not feel cold the way cold feels in summer. It feels like the cold has weight and intention. It grabs at you. It wants something from you. I got to her in maybe 4 steps, and the last 2 I was swimming. I got my hand under her chin and pulled her face up, and for a moment I thought she was already gone. Her skin was the color of birch bark. Her lips had that bluish look that means the blood has pulled away from the surface and gone down deep to protect the heart. Her hair was dark and plastered to her cheek and neck, and there was a cut above her left ear that had bled and then stopped bleeding the way cuts do when the body gets cold enough. I got her to the bank. I do not remember exactly how. I remember the cottonwood scraping my arm through my shirt. I remember her weight. She was not a big woman, but cold water makes everything heavier, and dead weight is different from living weight. She was not dead. I could feel something in her when I had her against my chest, dragging her to the shallows. Something still working, faint, but there. I got her up on the bank, and I turned her to her side, and I hit her back, flat-handed, hard. Once. Twice. The 3rd time she coughed, and the river came out of her, and she kept coughing, and I held her on her side until she was done. She did not open her eyes for a long time after that. I had a horse 50 yards up the bank. I had no fire. I had a blanket rolled behind the saddle because my grandmother taught me never to ride out in November without one, and I had never forgotten it. I got the blanket and I stripped her coat off. It was wool, soaked through, weighing probably as much as she did, and I wrapped her, and I got her up across the horse, and I walked us back to the village. The women took her from me when we got in. Standing Elk's wife, whoa, she was the one who organized it. She had the kind of authority that comes from having handled every kind of trouble for 30 years. She pointed at the lodge, pointed at 3 of the younger women, and they moved. I stood outside in the cold with my wet clothes stiffening on me, and I waited. My name is Thathanka Ska. In English they would say White Bull, though that is not a perfect translation. I was 44 years old that winter. I had been headman of our band for 11 years, since my father passed the responsibility to me the spring before he died. I had 2 daughters and no wife. My wife, Chantech Hinyan, the one I called Lark because of how she laughed, she had died of the fever 4 winters before. I had her daughters to raise and the band to lead, and the Americans pushing in from every direction, and I did not have time to grieve the way a man should grieve. You put it somewhere and you keep moving. That is what you do. I am telling you this so you understand the shape of me that winter, the shape of what I had become. Not a bad man, not a hard man in the way that means broken, but a man who had learned to keep himself at a certain distance from things. You lead people, you learn to do that. You stay a half step outside of your own feelings so you can see the situation whole. It is useful. It costs something, but it is useful. I stood outside the lodge and I waited, and after a while Woke came out and told me the woman was alive and warming. She had no injuries that would kill her. The cut on her head was shallow. She would sleep. I went and changed my clothes, and I built a fire in my own lodge, and I sat by it for a while thinking about the water sound I had heard before I saw her. That sound. I could not get it out of my ears. Her name was Margaret Voss. She told me this on the second day when she woke enough to be coherent. She said it in English first and then, haltingly, in a rough approximation of Lakota that surprised me. She had learned some words somewhere, not many, but the fact that she had tried said something about her. I spoke English. My father had insisted on it. He said a man who could only speak one language was half blind, and he had sent me to the missionary school in Chamberlain for 2 winters when I was a boy, and I had come back with the language and a deep appreciation for the fact that I would never have to go back. The school was cold and the food was bad, and the man who ran it believed that discomfort produced character. He was wrong about a great many things. Margaret Voss was 31 years old. She had come west from Ohio with her husband 3 years prior. He had plans, they always had plans, the men who came west. His plans involved a trading post on the Niobrara. The trading post had failed. He had then tried freighting. That had also failed. He had, by her account, been a man of considerable plans and limited follow-through. And last spring he had ridden south to find work and had not come back. And a man from Spotted Tail's agency had come through in August and told her that a white man matching her husband's description had been found shot on the road to Fort Robinson. Whether it was him or not she never knew for certain. She had stayed through the summer on the scraps of what remained of the trading post venture. When the snows came she had made a decision to go north and east toward the settlements on the river. She had had a horse. 3 days out the horse had broken through a shelf of ice on a creek crossing and pulled free, but she had gone in, and the horse had run, and she had walked for she did not know how long in wet clothes before she reached the White River. That is the short version. She told it to me in pieces over 3 days. She was not a woman who told things in a rush. She said what was necessary and then she stopped and you sat with it for a while. I have known people who fill silence because it frightens them. Margaret Voss was not one of those people. Silence did not seem to bother her at all. That was the first thing I noticed about her once she was well enough to be noticed. That stillness. It was the stillness of someone who had been alone for a long time and had made peace with it. Not happiness, peace, there is a difference. My daughters were curious about her in the way of girls that age Chantechinyan Chikala, who was 12 and went by Chikala, and Wambly Win, who was 9 and went by Win because she could not yet say the whole name without her tongue tripping. They circled the lodge where Margaret was resting like small hawks, and eventually Woe allowed them in. And within a day they had established a kind of communication that had nothing to do with shared language and everything to do with the fact that my daughters had been without a woman in the lodge for 4 years, and the want of it had never entirely left them. I did not think about what that meant. I noted it and I set it aside. I was good at setting things aside. The question of what to do with her came up in council on the 4th day. The Americans at Fort Robinson were 2 days' ride south. There were agency people at Spotted Tail's camp, 3 days east. Winter was coming down hard. There was no safe way to move her for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. Standing Elk said what he thought straightforwardly, which was that a white woman in a Lakota winter camp was a complication we did not need. He was not wrong. It was a complicated time. The army was looking for reasons. Every reason they found they used. I said that we would extend her the hospitality we would extend to any person in need, and that when she was well and the weather permitted, we would help her reach the settlement safely. I said this was what my father would have done, and what his father would have done, and I did not intend to change it on account of politics. Standing Elk nodded slowly. He was not a disagreeable man. He just said what he saw and then accepted what was decided. After the council broke, I walked out to the edge of the camp where the cottonwoods grew thick along the river, and I stood there in the late afternoon light. The sky was that particular color it gets in late November, a gray that is not quite gray, something between pewter and bone. The river was louder in the cold. I stood and listened to it. I thought about what I had pulled from that river. Not her specifically, not yet. I thought about the weight of her against my chest in the water. The way the cold had been trying to take her, and I had refused to let it. I thought about that simple refusal and what it had meant in my body. Something had come awake, something that had been in a kind of sleep. I did not name it, not then. She asked me about the cut on her head on the 5th day, asked who had stitched it. I told her Woe had. She asked if she could thank her, and I told her she already had by staying alive. Woe had no patience for people who made good nursing go to waste. She laughed at that, a short sound, like the laugh had surprised her. She was sitting up by then, wrapped in a trade blanket with a horn cup of broth in her hands. Her hair had dried, and I could see it was a dark reddish brown, the color of chokecherry bark in summer. She was not beautiful in the way the word usually gets used. She was something more specific than that. Sharp-faced, clear-eyed, with the look of someone who had thought carefully about a great many things and come to conclusions she trusted. There was no softness in it, but there was something that drew the eye and held it. I brought her food that evening. My daughters had been doing it, but they were with their aunt that afternoon, and I brought it myself. It was not a remarkable thing to do. I told myself it was not remarkable. She said, without looking up from the bowl, "Thank you for the river." I said, "That was 4 days ago." She said, "I know. I've been trying to find the right time to say it." I sat down on the opposite side of the fire. The light moved between us. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear it working at the top of the lodge poles. She said, "I don't have anything to offer you for it." I said, "I didn't take you out of the river to be offered something." She looked at me then, not the quick look of politeness, the long look of someone who is trying to see whether a thing is true. She said, "No, I don't think you did." And then she went back to her bowl. I sat there for a while. We did not talk much more that evening, but I stayed longer than was necessary to deliver food, and I was aware of it, and I stayed anyway. December came in like a fist. 3 days of snow so heavy that you could not see the lodge across the camp. Then a cold snap that made the air hurt to breathe. Then a day of brutal clear sky, the kind of clarity that comes after real cold, where everything looks like it has been cut from bone. Margaret was on her feet by the end of the first week of December. Not steady, not strong, but on her feet. She was not the type to stay down longer than necessary. That was evident early. She asked Woe what she could do to help with the work, and Woe, who had been skeptical, observed her for half a day and then put her to work. She learned what she needed to learn without complaint and without making a production of the learning, which Woe later told me. In the blunt way she told me everything was rarer than it ought to be. My daughters adopted her. There is no other word for it. Chikala began teaching her Lakota words with the focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about, drilling her, correcting her, occasionally sighing at a mispronunciation with a world weariness impressive in a 12-year-old. Win simply followed her everywhere, which was Win's way of loving something. She had followed a camp dog the same way for 3 months when she was 6. I watched all of this from my usual distance, doing what I did, making the calculations a head man has to make, keeping the balance, handling the disputes and the decisions and the steady erosion of winter, meeting with standing elk about the horse herd, riding out when I needed to, coming back. But I noticed things. I noticed that when I came back into camp and Margaret was somewhere visible, I located her before I located my daughters. I noticed this, and I did not know what to do with it, so I filed it and kept moving. I noticed that she watched me work, not openly, from the corner of things, the way you watch something you are trying to understand. I had grown up being watched. Leadership brings that, but this was different. This was not the watching of assessment or politics. It was something else. I noticed that she had a particular way of going still when she was thinking hard, like the rest of her body went quiet to give the thinking room. I had never seen another person do it quite that way. And I noticed that when I brought her food, which I continued to do some evenings without having decided to make it a practice, she would look up from whatever she was doing and there was something in her face that I had not seen in a long time. Not need, not gratitude exactly, recognition, like she saw the person who walked in and not just the gesture. My wife used to look at me that way, Lark, before the fever. I had not known I was hungry for that look until I saw it again. That is the truest thing I can tell you about that winter. There was trouble in the second week of December. 2 men came into camp from the south, Americans. A big man with a cavalry beard who said his name was Colton, and a smaller, quieter one who did not give a name. They said they were looking for a woman. They described Margaret. They said she was the widow of a man who owed considerable debts, and that there were interests who wished to speak with her regarding those debts. I stood outside in the cold, and I listened to this. Colton did most of the talking. He had the voice of a man used to being believed on account of his size. He said they would take her and be gone, and there would be no trouble. He said this the way men say things when they want you to hear the word trouble as a threat wrapped in a promise. I said, "The woman is a guest in our camp. She is recovering from injury." He said, "That's very hospitable of you, Chief. Now I'd like to speak with her." I said, "When she is well enough to receive visitors and chooses to receive them, she may. Until then she is under the protection of this camp." He shifted his weight. The quiet one had moved slightly to his left, which was a positioning thing which I noted. Colton said, "I don't think you understand the situation." I said, "I understand it clearly." He said some more things. He got louder with each one. I did not change my expression or my position. When he had finished, I told him they were welcome to camp at the edge of our settlement and accept food for one night on account of the weather, but that they would not come further in, and that the woman's whereabouts were her own business to share or not share as she chose, and that was the end of it. He stared at me for a long moment with the particular look of a man who is measuring whether to push and deciding against it. They left the next morning. I had men watch them until they were out of sight. I told Margaret that evening. I told her plainly and without dressing it up. She sat with it. Her hands were still on her knees. Her face did not do very much. She said, "That's my husband made." I said, "That's what he told it as." She said, "Thomas owed money to a lot of people, none of it mine to pay." I said, "I know." She looked at me, that long look. She said, "You turned them away without asking me." I said, "You were sick." She said, "I'm not sick now." I said, "No, you're not." She said, "What would you have done if I'd wanted to go with them?" I said, "Put you on a horse and taken you to them myself." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "But you don't think they were owed what they said they were owed?" I said, "A man in debt for his own bad plans cannot transfer that debt to his wife. That is how I see it." She said very quietly, "That's how I see it too." We sat on opposite sides of the fire. The wind was working again at the tops of the poles. My daughters were asleep in the back of the lodge, and I could hear Wynne breathing in the particular deep, slow way she slept. Margaret said, "Your daughters are good. You've done well with them." I said, "Their mother gave them most of what they are." She said, "They've had 4 years without her." I said, "Yes." She said, "Kids that age don't feel that themselves. Someone has to help." She was not accusing me of anything. She was just saying what she saw. That was how she was. She said things plain and left you to sit with them. I sat with it. She said, "I'm sorry about your wife." I said, "It was a long time ago." She said, "That doesn't always matter." I said, "No, it doesn't." The fire burned down a little. I put another piece of wood on it. The sparks went up and scattered. She said, "I've been thinking about what you did. In the river. I've been thinking about what it would take for a man to go into water that cold without stopping to think." I said, "I didn't think." She said, "I know. That's what I've been thinking about." I did not know what to say to that, so I did not say anything. After a while she said she was tired, and I left, and I walked back to my own lodge in the dark and the cold, and I stood outside it for a moment before going in. The stars were very clear. The cold makes them sharp like that, brings them close. I stood there, and I let myself feel what I had been setting aside for 3 weeks. Christmas came and went by the white man's calendar. The cold broke slightly in the last days of December, enough to breathe without pain, and Margaret walked the perimeter of the camp each morning and afternoon, building her strength back deliberately the way she did everything. My daughters sometimes walked with her. Sometimes I did. We talked on those walks, or we did not talk, and either was comfortable. She asked me about the land not as scenery, as a thing to understand, where the deer came from, why the cottonwoods grew where they grew, what the river had looked like in summer. I told her, and she listened the way good listeners do, not filling the space after each thing with their own response, just taking it in. I showed her a place on the high bank east of camp where you could see a long way. The plain ran out flat to the south with the sky sitting right down on it, and the light was different up there, cleaner, and she stood at the edge of it and looked for a long time without saying anything. She said, "This is the most land I've ever seen in one look." I said, "This is a small piece of it." She said, "I know, that's almost the harder thought." I asked her once what Ohio was like. She thought about it and she said, "Smaller, greener, enclosed, like the land was doing something you could follow. Here it just is." She stopped and started again. "Back home I always knew where I was because of what was around me. Here I keep losing myself." She looked at me. "Does that go away?" I said, "Eventually you learn to find yourself by the sky instead of what's around you." She said, "How long does that take?" I said, "A winter or 2. She looked at me again, that look. She said, "So you're saying I'll be here a winter or 2. I had not meant it that way, or I had and didn't know it. I said, "The trail to the settlements will be open in March." She said, "I know it will." She looked back out at the plain. I looked at the same plain. We stood there for a while, with the cold moving around us like a slow river. New Year came. The Lakota do not mark it particularly, but I knew the date by the calendar in my head. My father had kept one, a habit from his trading days, and I had grown up knowing dates even when they had no ceremony attached. I noted it privately. That night I sat by my fire, and I let myself think clearly about what I was thinking. She would leave in March. That was the truth of it. The trail would open and she would go to the settlements, and there was no reason she would not, no reason at all, and it was right that she should go. She was a white woman alone on the frontier, and the settlements would give her the safety and the options she could not have here. That was simply true. What was also true was that my lodge had felt different since she had been in the camp. Not changed exactly, restored to something closer to what it had been. My daughters were different, lighter, more complete. Wynn had started drawing things again, pictures scratched in the dirt or pressed into the snow, something she had stopped doing after her mother died. Chikala had, for the first time in years, brought a question to dinner that was not about horses or hunting or practical things. She had asked what her mother had been like when she laughed. I told her. Chikala had nodded gravely and said that was what she thought. She had not said why. And I was different. I was aware of being in a room, of the temperature of a fire, of whether the light was good or poor. I had not been aware of those things for a long time. You go through life with the edges of yourself turned off to manage the weight of it, and then something turns them back on, and the world gets very loud and present, and it is uncomfortable, and it is also the opposite of nothing. I sat by the fire, and I was honest with myself. I did not want her to go. That was the thing, plain and whole. I did not want her to go. What I did about it was another matter. Standing Elk came to my lodge in the 2nd week of January. He sat and accepted the cup I offered, and he was quiet for longer than usual, which with Standing Elk meant something was working in him. He said, "The white woman." I said, "Her name is Margaret." He said, "Margaret." He tried the word, the 2 syllables. He said, "The soldiers at Robinson will hear about her eventually." I said, "Probably." He said, "What will you tell them?" I said, "That she was injured and is a guest, that she will go to the settlements in spring. That is all there is to tell." He said, "That is what you see when you look at this." It was not quite a question. I looked at him. Standing Elk was 60 years old, and he had known me since I was born, and there was not much that moved past him. I said, "I see a woman who nearly died on our land and whom we took in and helped, which is what we do." He said, "And the rest of it?" I said, "What rest of it?" He looked at me with the expression he had been using on me since I was a boy, the one that meant he was not going to help me pretend. I said, "It's not relevant." He said, "If it weren't relevant, you wouldn't be saying it isn't." I looked at the fire. He said, "Your father found your mother in the middle of a hard winter too. She was half Ojibwe, which gave people plenty to say. He said he didn't care what people had to say because a man of standing could make his own choices about his own life, and the band would respect those choices if the choices were made with integrity." He was right. He drank from the cup. He said, "I am not giving you my opinion on the matter. I am telling you I've already seen where this is going, and I am not opposed to it." He left after that. I sat by the fire for a long time. It was a Sunday in late January when it happened. Though I did not know the day then, I only worked it out afterward. There had been a small crisis in the morning. One of the younger men had gotten into a dispute with his brother over horses, the kind of thing that can turn bad fast in the close quarters of winter camp, and I had spent 3 hours mediating it and come out feeling like I had shoveled snow the whole time. Disputes that are really about grief and boredom dress themselves as disputes about horses, and it takes 3 hours to peel the horse off and get to the grief. I came back to my lodge in the early afternoon, and Margaret was there. She had been helping Woe in the morning, and had come to check on something she had left drying near my fire, herbs of some kind, something she and Woe had been working on together, a practical collaboration that had evolved without any declaration. She was kneeling by the fire checking them, and she looked up when I came in. She said, "Long morning." I said, "Yes." I sat down. She stayed where she was. The fire was going well and the lodge was warm relative to outside, which that January meant merely that you could feel your hands. She said, "Do you want to tell me about it, or do you want to sit quietly?" That stopped me. Not because it was an unexpected question, because of the weight of it, because no one had asked me that in 4 years. What do you need? Do you want to talk or be still? A simple, practical, caring question, offered with no performance around it. I said quietly, "I think." She said, "All right." And she stayed. She did not leave to give me solitude. She stayed in the lodge, and she went back to what she was doing with the herbs, and I sat by the fire, and was quietly in the same space as another person for the first time in I do not know how long. It was the specific comfort of presence without demand. After a while she made tea. She handed me a cup. She sat down on the other side of the fire with her own cup. We sat there. After a while I said, "What do you think you'll do when you get to the settlements?" She said, "Find work. I can read and write and add, I can keep books, I can teach. There are always children who need teaching." I said, "You'd be a teacher." She said, "I was one, before Thomas. I had a school in Zanesville for 2 years." She stopped. "Then I was good at it, I think." I said, "What happened to it?" She said, "Thomas happened to it." She said it without bitterness, just as fact. He was persuasive when he wanted something. He wanted me to come west. I let myself be persuaded. I said, "Do you regret it?" She thought about it. She said, "I regret the waste of it, his life and the years in between." She looked at the fire. "But I don't know that I'd have come to this place otherwise. And this place," she stopped. I waited. She said, This place has been the most honest place I've been in a long time. I said, honest how? She said, out here things are what they are. The cold is cold, the danger is danger. The kindness is, she stopped again. She said, you pulled me out of a river, you could have walked past. No one would have known. She looked at me. Why didn't you walk past? I said, that is not a question. She said, what do you mean? I said, when a person is drowning, the question of whether to help them is not a real question. It only feels like a question from a distance. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, I think that's the truest thing anyone has said to me in years. I put down my cup. I did not plan what I said next. It arrived and I said it. I said, I don't want you to go in March. The fire made its sound. Outside the wind was low and steady, not the angry wind, just the presence of winter doing what winter does. She said, I know. I said, that's all I wanted to say. I'm not asking anything. She said, I know that too. She looked at me, not the corner of things look, full on. Her eyes were gray in most light and darker in firelight, and right now they were doing something complicated that I did not fully have the vocabulary for. She had been alone for a long time. I had been alone for a long time. Two people who had gotten good at the skill of it and were sitting across a fire from each other in a warm lodge in the middle of a cold world. She said, what would it look like if I stayed? I said, it would look like what it looks like now for a start. She said, and then? I said, I'm not going to tell you a beautiful story. Life here is hard. It's going to stay hard. The Americans are not going to stop coming, and the land is going to keep shrinking, and I don't know what the next 10 years look like, and I would be lying if I said I did. She said, I've been lied to by a man who told me beautiful stories. I said, I know. She said, is there anything else you want to tell me? I said, my daughters need a woman in this lodge. That is true, and I want to say it plainly so it's not hidden under something else. They need it, and I can see you with them, and I can see what that does to all three of you. But that is a separate thing from what I'm saying. What I'm saying underneath that is that I am a man who has been running on duty and purpose for 4 years, and I had forgotten what it felt like to look forward to an evening. And I look forward to every evening lately. And I don't know what to do with that except to say it. She set her cup down. She stood up and she came around the fire and she sat down beside me close, the blanket she had been wrapped in coming with her. She did not say anything. She just sat there beside me, where before there had been the space of a fire between us. I could feel the warmth of her, not the fire, her. She put her hand on mine. Her hand was rough from the work of the winter and her fingers were cold, and she put it over my hand and kept it there. She said, I don't have anything to promise yet. I need you to know that. I said, I'm not asking for a promise. She said, but I'm not leaving in March. I did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. I turned my hand over and I held hers and we sat by the fire. And outside the winter went on doing what winter does. And inside the lodge there was warmth and the sound of my younger daughter breathing in her sleep, and the particular quiet of two people who have been alone long enough that they recognize what the opposite of that feels like. February passed. March came in slowly, the way it does in this country, grudging about it, with cold snaps that made you think winter had reconsidered, and then days of melt that made you believe in things again. The trail south opened on the 14th of March, by my reckoning. I knew because Standing Elk rode it and came back and said it was passable. Margaret knew, because she had been watching the weather the way a person watches something they are making a decision about. She did not go. She did not make an announcement about it. She simply did not pack and did not mention going, and one morning she came to my lodge with a proposal, which was the word she used, proposal, very serious and direct. And the proposal was that she would stay through the spring as a helper, a worker, contributing in the ways she had been contributing, and see how things went, and I agreed, and that was how she stayed for the spring. Spring became summer. In the summer, my daughters taught her to ride properly, which she had done badly before and did considerably better after 2 months of Chikala's instruction. She taught my daughters to read English with a rigor and patience that Chikala in particular thrived on. Wynne learned to read mostly as a side effect of following her older sister, which was how Wynne learned most things. I watched my daughters with her. I watched the way she listened to them. Really listened the way good teachers do, which is the way good parents do, not waiting for her turn to speak, not half present but actually in it with them, following the thread of what they were saying, treating their thoughts as worth taking seriously. And I watched my daughters open under that, the way a plant opens when it has the light it needed. Chikala asked harder questions. Wynne started talking more, in longer sentences, as if she had been waiting for someone to fill the space for before she bothered to fill it herself. One afternoon in July, I came back from a long ride to find all three of them at the river with their feet in the water. They were laughing about something. I came up quietly, and I stood at the top of the bank and I watched them. Wynne was in Margaret's lap mostly. Margaret had her arms loosely around her and they were looking at something in the water. A fish, I found out later. A very large catfish that had taken up residence under a particular rock. And Chikala was explaining something about the fish with great authority, and Margaret was listening with great seriousness, and Wynne was giggling. I stood there for a while. I thought about my wife. I thought about Lark and how she had been with the girls and how they had loved her, and how the loss of her had made them smaller for a while, narrower, how grief shrinks children the same way it shrinks adults. And I thought about what was on the bank of that river now, and how nothing about it was a replacement, how a thing like this is not a replacement for anything, how it is its own creature, its own true thing, and how I had been wrong to think there was only one version of a life I could live. Margaret looked up and saw me on the bank. She did not call out or wave, she just looked at me with that look. I came down the bank and Wynne scrambled up and ran at me, and I caught her, and the catfish, startled by the noise, shot out from under its rock and disappeared downstream, and Chikala made a sound of real frustration, and began explaining to Margaret why the catfish was now gone and who was responsible, with great precision. Margaret stood up from the bank and she came to where I was standing, Wynne still on my hip, and she put her hand on my arm and she looked at me and she said, "You look tired." I said, "Long ride." She said, "Come sit." I sat and she sat beside me, and Wynne climbed from me to her and back again, with the ease of a child who sees no boundary between the two of you. And the sun came down through the cottonwood leaves in pieces, and the river went past, and Chikala was still talking about the catfish. I was not tired anymore. We married in September by 2 ceremonies, one in the Lakota way, which was proper, and one conducted by a traveling minister who came through in October, and who, after initially expressing concern about the arrangement, came to accept it over 2 hours of conversation with Margaret that I was not present for and do not know the full content of. He seemed slightly shaken at the end of it. Margaret had a way of making an argument that stayed with you. Standing Elk gave me a look at the ceremony that contained, in its economy, the complete sentiment of "I told you so" and also the complete sentiment of "I am glad for you." And if you think those are contradictory, you have not known Standing Elk. Woe gave Margaret a particular beaded bag she had made herself, which was the highest form of Woe's approval, as everyone who knew her understood. Margaret seemed to understand this without being told. My daughters were who they were by then. Chikala had, with the directness of 12-year-olds, asked Margaret at some point in the summer whether she was going to be their mother. Margaret had said, as I understood it, that she wasn't going to try to be their mother, that their mother was their mother and always would be, but that she was going to be there, every day, for whatever they needed, and that she would do that for as long as they'd let her. Chikala had apparently found this answer acceptable. Wynne had apparently fallen asleep during the conversation, which was Wynne's way of expressing profound comfort with a situation. I am going to tell you about one more evening, because it is the one that stays with me. It was late October, our first autumn as married people. The cold was coming back. You could feel it in the morning, that edge, the smell of the air changing. We were outside after dinner, the girls inside the lodge, the camp quiet around us. We were sitting on a blanket on the high bank I had shown her the previous winter, the one where you could see a long way south. The plain was amber and rust with the dead grass. The sky was that late October color, the last of the sunset still sitting in the west, the dark coming from the east, the two meeting overhead in a band of deep blue-green that you see in no other season. She was leaning against me, her shoulder against my arm, her head tilted slightly toward me. I had my arm around her and I could feel her breathing. She said, "Tell me what this looked like before I came." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "This, your evenings, what they felt like." I thought about how to say it true. I said, "Like a man finishing work, sitting down because the day was done. No more to it than that." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I'm sitting down because I want to be here." She was quiet. Then she said, "I think about that a lot, what you said in January, that you look forward to the evenings." She stopped. I didn't know what it would feel like to have a man say something like that. I said, "How does it feel?" She said very quietly, like being seen, like being a specific person in a specific place and having someone know that, and she stopped. She said, "I had a whole life where I was just the woman beside someone, whatever he needed, whatever the situation needed. I was the shape that fit the space." She took a breath. She said, "You see me differently than that." I said, "I see you." She turned and she looked at me. Not from across a fire, not from across a distance. Right there, close, her face in the last of the evening light. She said, "I know you do. That's what I'm trying to tell you." She reached up and she put her hand against the side of my face, her fingers against my jaw. She held it there. "This is the moment I want you to carry, the one I come back to. Not the river, not the ceremonies, not any of the larger events that have the shape of stories. Just her hand on my face on that bank in October with the amber plain running south and the stars just beginning, and the two of us sitting there like people who had been looking for each other in the dark and had, against the reasonable odds, found each other." She said, "You are the most capable and steady man I have ever known. And I want you to know that I see it, all of it, every bit of it." I could not speak for a moment. I put my hand over hers, the way I had done in January by the fire. I said, "That is enough. That right there is enough for me." She leaned back into me and I held her, and the stars came out one by one over the long plain, and the river ran below us in the dark, making that sound it makes, not the November sound, not the sound between breathing and dying, but the summer going to autumn sound, something easy and permanent, something that has been there a long time and is not going anywhere. I sat there holding my wife on the bank above the river where I had found her. I do not know how to explain what a man feels when the life he had stopped expecting shows up and sits down beside him and stays. I know what it is not. It is not soft, and it is not simple, and it is not the feeling of being rescued, though I had been, in all the ways that do not show. It is something harder and quieter and more permanent than any of that. It is the feeling of being known. It is the feeling of a good woman choosing to stay. That is the whole of it. That is everything.